all for being here for the Andrea Mitchell Center's Race and Politics event, Checking Your Privilege, Perspectives on the Politics of White Identity. My name is Katie Rader, and I'm a graduate fellow here in the Andrea Mitchell Center. I'm also a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science here at Penn, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this discussion tonight. I want to especially thank our panelists who are here this evening, the Andrea Mitchell Center, and my co-fellows for making tonight possible, and a special welcome to our visitors here from the city of Lambertville, New Jersey. So we're joined here this evening by 4 excellent panelists whose work reflects a variety of disciplinary, epistemological, and political positions in thinking about white identity politics and white privilege discourse, and specifically how it hinders or helps the realization of greater racial equality. Now, I hope many of you will have the opportunity, have had the opportunity to read the excellent briefs that our panelists wrote for our event tonight. Those are giving us a great launching point for the conversation. But in case you missed them, you can always read them afterwards, and they can be found on the event page. So just a few notes before I introduce our panelists and kick things off. I wanted to share a few logistical pieces of information. We are going to have plenty of time tonight for audience question and answer. So please feel free to submit your questions using the question and answer function on Zoom. You should be able to see in the bottom bar of your Zoom window. We'll do our best to make it through as many of the questions as we can this evening. The chat for this event is disabled, so if you are having any logistical or technical issues, you can use the Q&A function as well. Let us know and we'll hopefully be able to work to address that. And very last thing, tonight's event is going to be recorded and we'll post it on the Andrea Mitchell Center website, so you can check back for that in the coming days. So to start, I want to introduce each of our panelists by asking them to describe and quickly summarize the key points and position that they've taken in the briefs they wrote for today. As a reminder, these briefs were responding to the question, what kind of politics are enabled by the study of white identity and or white privilege? So I'll introduce our panelists as we go along. And to start, I'm very excited to introduce Professor Eduardo Bonilla-Silva. Professor Bonilla-Silva is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Duke University. He gained visibility in the social sciences with his 1997 American Sociological Review article, Rethinking Racism Toward a Structural Interpretation, where he challenged analysts to study racial matters structurally rather than from the sterile prejudice perspective. A more recent book, Racism Without Racists, has also become a classic in the field and influenced scholars in education, religious studies, political science, rhetoric, psychology, legal studies, and sociology. So Eduardo, I'll turn it to you now to get things started for us.
Okay, so let me begin by making one point in which I think most of us agree. So like most of my fellow panelists, I regard democratic socialism as the ultimate cure for many, albeit certainly not all, of the ills afflicting our nation. My difference with my colleagues is on the type of politics we need to advance the socialist agenda. I, for one, do not believe that bringing race to the political table is divisive or amounts to what my colleagues refer to as identity politics, because race has been essential to the structure and superstructure of capitalism, at least since the 16th century. After all, the process of primitive accumulation makes no sense without grasping the centrality that colonialism and race-making had in this process, something that Marx himself acknowledged, albeit in a fragmentary and incomplete way. Racism then is not mere prejudice or an ideology used by the bourgeoisie to divide workers, but a core element of the fabric of modern capitalist societies. Racism and capitalism, as authors such as Cedric Robinson have argued, are co-constitutive, and the process of capital accumulation in the wealth system continues unabated today due to various racial projects and practices. All the classes in the class structure, not just the working class, have been racially segmented for a long, long time. Therefore, studying the racial division is analytically and politically fruitful. By examining, for example, the white identities, and the plural here is important, of workers, of the middle class, and of capitalists, we can map the practices, traditions, and material conditions that reproduce de-racialization, as well as the fractures that emerge in the process. Lastly, I hope that today we address racialization as a global phenomenon and not limit our comments to the US. After all, because workers in the third world, in peripheral countries, in colonies and neo-colonies, have experienced the highest levels of systemic race-class exploitation, they have engaged in more revolutionary activity since 1791, the year of the Haitian Revolution, than the industrial workers in advanced capitalist societies. To sum up, we cannot address the class question in America and the world without dealing in a straightforward fashion with the race question.
Thank you very much. So next, I'm happy to introduce one of my colleagues here, HADASS, who is a doctoral candidate in the political science department here at the University of Pennsylvania. Working in the tradition of critical theory, she writes about racial justice, economic justice, German political thought, and social movements. Currently, she's examining the question, how should we think about race in order to promote effective activist organizing? So HADASS, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you, Katie, for all your organizing work with this, and the AMC for hosting this. And I'm very much looking forward to our conversation about identity and privilege and racial justice, and I'm glad to be a part of it. So my answer to this question, what kind of politics are enabled by the study of white identity and/or white privilege, is that I believe that these studies enable conservative politics that help sustain a racially and relatedly economically an egalitarian status quo. And I think we'll get into the reasons why more as this conversation unfolds, but I'd like to preview kind of the three overarching points that a lot of my critique of white privilege and white identity politics fit into. So the first is one problem that is people are more well aware of, which is the essentialization of people based on race. This essentializing people based on race is the cornerstone and the bedrock of racism. And there are a lot of ways to describe race, and I'm not against using the words white, race, and racism and looking at these things, and we absolutely need to. But the definitions that appear in the literature on white identity politics and white privilege discourse operate in ways that reify race. So hopefully we'll get to talk about that more. The next critique I'll quote a little bit from what I wrote, is that white privilege discourse, we don't, in progressive movements, using the word privilege is antithetical to the project. We don't, in progressive movements, want to paint certain things that are widespread as privileges that we think ought to be, that we think all people ought to have access to. So I write in mine, abolitionists did not call freedom a privilege, they called slavery an injustice. Civil rights leaders did not call voting a privilege, they called voter suppression an injustice, and we should not call avoiding racial prejudice a privilege, we should call discrimination injustice. So this has to do with framing the conversation. And my final point, and the point that I think is most important to the issue at hand, is that white identity and white privilege studies undermine calls for cross-racial worker solidarity and demands for universal public goods. And I think both of these are the most necessary elements to achieving meaningful racial justice in the United States. So really looking forward to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Our third panelist, I'm happy to welcome Ashley JARDINA. Ashley JARDINA is an assistant professor of political science, also at Duke University, and the author of the recent book, White Identity Politics. She researches and teaches on racism, racial identity, and politics. Her work has also been covered widely in outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and The Economist. So Ashley, I'm happy to turn things over to you now.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for having me, Katie. And I really look forward to this conversation, and I'm thankful to my fellow panelists for being here. I want to begin by saying I think people are sort of trying to figure out the landscape of our arguments, that I actually see a lot of my work as really in the tradition of a lot of the work that Dr. BONILLA-SILVA has done. And so I think, well, we don't always agree on everything. A lot of the work that he's done was very influential to the work that I'm doing. So, race is one of the most enduring social cleavages in the US. Racism is one of the most pernicious social forces in American political and social economic life. And one common refrain is that the best way to fight racism is to ignore race, to not see race, as if we could will this enduring social cleavage away somehow so that it evaporates. And the strategy, of course, gets us into the realm of colorblindness, where racial inequality persists because we do not attend to it. And not only do we not fight for it, but we use colorblindness as a strategy or tool to squash any efforts to seek racial equality. I think another complaint leveled at the left and at academics in particular is that they've become obsessed with celebrating the differences of various racial or ethnic groups in a way that subverts unity and obscures real social problems like economic inequality. And I think there's probably some of that, but mostly what I see when I look around are very smart people working very hard to illuminate the nature and the cause and the consequences of racial and ethnic and economic inequalities and injustices, and trying to find ways to combat these problems. But the work I do as a social scientist, I think, cuts into these questions and problems from a somewhat different angle from these two perspectives. So I use the tools of empirical social science by using surveys and experiments to ask how and what everyday Americans think about race and racism, and to explain how these attitudes influence their political preferences and behavior. I'm interested especially in how white Americans view race and how they've been responding to growing racial and ethnic diversity in the US over the past 20 years. And what I find is that many white Americans, in fact, about 30 to 40% of white Americans, possess a sense of racial solidarity with their group. They have a psychological attachment to their racial group, and this motivates them to want to protect and preserve the power and status of their group. So the question for me that I wrote in my brief is, the one that's most important is, what do we miss by not studying white identity politics? What we miss is the fact that in the US, racism comes not only in a form that I think we all recognize, the outward hostility that some white people have toward people of color, the thing we often call prejudice, it also comes in the form of whites trying to maintain their group's power and status. And what I mean by this is the sense of solidarity that some whites have. And it's not the same as prejudice. In fact, many whites who possess this sense of identity, they don't hold necessarily some of the attitudes or beliefs we think of as prejudice. But this identity does help maintain a racially inegalitarian society, one in which white people are the dominant group at the top of a racial hierarchy, and which whites have the lion's share of social, economic, and political resources in the US. And if we want to understand some of today's most pressing problems in the United States, including immigration, attitudes about immigration, opposition to Barack Obama, the election of Donald Trump, the Capitol insurrection, much of the democratic backsliding that we're observing in the US, we have to understand these aren't merely a function of racial prejudice. They're also driven by whites who are interested in protecting and preserving the power and status of their group. And so I think a lot of scholars have been drawing our attention for a long time to this racial hierarchy and all the ways in which our world has been structured in a way to preserve this. And part of what my work does is help us understand the psychological forces at the individual level that motivate whites to endorse this hierarchy and respond in ways that they see as threatening to this arrangement.
Thank you very much. And our final introduction and our final opening statement, Walter Ben Michaels teaches English at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He's the author of several books. Most relevantly for our discussion today is his book, The Trouble with Diversity, which appeared in a 10th anniversary edition in 2016. And more recently, his book, The Beauty of a Social Problem, Photography, Autonomy, Economy. A selection of his and Adolph Reed's essays is also forthcoming from Eris Press, and he and Daniel Zamora are currently at work on a book about the aesthetics of deindustrialization. So Walter, turning to you now. Oh, you're muted. There we go.
Probably the last time I'll ever be muted. Thank you, Katie, and thanks to everybody for being here. So I want to say really quickly, I agree with HADASS that focus on racial disparity is profoundly conservative. And I'm just going to give a quick example of why. So the fastest growing job in the US today is healthcare aide. Healthcare aides are very badly paid. They make a little under $25,000 a year. And they are disproportionately women of color. If we're striving mainly for racial, and in this case would also be sexual equality, the solution is making it possible for more women of color to get better jobs, not be healthcare aides. So instead of making up half of healthcare aides, they'd be closer to their actual percentage in the US, about 20%. That'd be the happy ending. But there would, of course, still be people taking those jobs, the fastest growing job in the US. And those people would still be paid less than $25,000 a year. So for them, no happy ending. And for the society as a whole, more racial equality, but no more equality. Conversely, most of the people making money in the healthcare industry are white men. But making sure that a proportionate number of them were women of color instead would also make no contribution at all to a more equal society. If we want more equality instead of a fairer way of administering inequality, our focus should be not on who has to take the bad jobs and who gets the good ones, but on minimizing the difference between them. Major health systems report $1 billion in annual profits is a headline from about 3 weeks ago. They had a good year in 2020. As long as we're asking the shareholders and executives of those systems to check their privilege, we're making it pleasurable for them also to check their bank accounts. Identifying the injustice of inequality with discrimination, the discourse of white privilege leaves the actual mechanisms of capital, the fact that the boss's yearly profit of $1 billion, no matter what race they belong to, that their profit is only possible because of the workers' yearly salary of $25,000, no matter what race they belong to, leaving those mechanisms untouched. When rich people pay people like us to worry about white privilege, in my view, they're getting their money's worth.
Thank you. All right, so hopefully now, for those of you who read the papers, you are refreshed on what the primary points here. And now I want to launch with just one more framing question to make sure we're sort of clear on our objective today. We're all academics, but I think many in the audience are probably not in institutions of higher ed. And we very specifically made the focus of this event today focus on the politics that are enabled by this. So I want to ask how we can think about this question and focus on politics is really different than some of the ways we focus on questions in academia, or perhaps you disagree and think it's not. Just a line in Ashley's brief really sparked this for me. I'll just read it now. Despite overwhelming interest in the concept identity politics, however, it is not often that scholars take the opportunity we have been given to step back from the minutiae of our research to consider not just the normative implications of group identities, but also to reflect on the social and political implications of studying the concept in the first place. So I want to ask just this additional framing question: what's important about studying the politics of this question? And Ashley, since I quoted from you, we can start with you, but also if there's anyone else who's interested in jumping in.
Yeah, so I want to try to put on the table and clarify the fact that I think there are sort of two, for at least in my mind, kind of debates that are tying this conversation together. The debate that I most often see myself situated in is, do white people even think about their race? Do they have an identity? Is it something that we can measure? Does it have political consequences? And the world I work in for a long time has said no. And what my research does is say, actually, yes, it does. And this is a conversation that's not unrelated to this separate conversation that we were also having, which is, what do we make of the fact that in academia, there's sort of a pressure as part of trying to help normatively create a racially egalitarian society, this idea that we're trying to perpetuate that white people are privileged, that they need to check their privilege. And the reason they're not unrelated is the work that I do is structured by the fact that white people have the disproportionate share of social, economic, and political power. And so that's what the people on this side mean when they say, you know, white people sort of need to check their privilege. I see a lot of what I do is sort of tangential to this sort of inside baseball conversation, because part of what I'm up to is trying to understand how everyday citizens understand the world, and less about sort of what are the inside baseball quibbles within academia. But I don't think that these debates are unimportant. And part of why they're not is that there's an argument that the thing I study, it's to some extent was fueled by pressure on the left coming out of the 1960s into the 70s and 80s, particularly within academia, to sort of celebrate multiculturalism, and that the backlash that we're observing among white Americans today is a backlash to sort of this conversation about multiculturalism. And I think that's sort of part of what's really interesting about this conversation. And I think of us sort of today trying to kind of take a meta view here to think about what are we doing by having this debate, having this conversation, and what can we learn as academics by taking a moment to take a step back and think about how, when our work makes its way into popular and public discourse, is it interpreted and what does that mean?
Thank you. I see a hand from HADASS here as well.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you, Ashley, for the response. So yeah, I think there's a fairly large difference between analytical and pragmatic approaches to studying this stuff. When I think analytically, I think the main purpose is to be descriptive in some way, versus pragmatically, the main purpose is to produce some type of political, probably moral outcome, ethical outcome. And so, Ashley, for example, you mentioned that 40% of white people value their solidarity, is that right? And value kind of being united in some ways. So that, I would say, kind of falls into this analytical camp. I have some skepticism of the analytics there, because there's either circularity in terms of what is whiteness when you're asking it, or some type of a priori conception, some beforehand conception of how white people think, how white people are, or how we signify whiteness, that I think can reify racial identities, but that's in the analytic camp. In the pragmatic camp, what I see my work is in the pragmatic camp. How do we want to think about these things to produce the type of political activism that would make social change? And so whether or not that piece of analytics is true, we can look at it. But if we focus on the fact that there's this quote unquote white solidarity, enforcing the idea that people have something to lose, that they're privileged by having this white solidarity, and that they have something meaningful to give up, is not going to encourage people to fight against racism or economic inequality, because the messaging they're receiving is that, oh, you're in fact privileged right now. What would you want to give that up for? So pragmatically, when I'm framing conversations of race, my idea is, how do we want to frame this? Because truth can be narrativized in different ways. What is the narrativizing of the truth of the situation that makes people want to be in solidarity and form a better world?
Okay, I see both Walter and Eduardo are also on the queue. So Walter and then Eduardo.
So I totally defer to Ashley on how many white people value their whiteness. But I totally agree that, part of the whole point of white identity has been to get people to value their whiteness. So let's say it's 30, 40, 50, 60, or 70%. I flat guarantee you that 100% of rich people value their money. And that like 100% of not rich people value, or whatever the right word would be, their lack of money. And actually, when we think about the relation between what we do in the academy, and especially what we do in institutions like this one, that is the ones that we represent in various ways, and including the one that's hosting us, I think it's a striking and it's an important fact that we have institutions that are in effect both by and for the upper class, and that spend an exhaustive amount of time talking about the question of race, rather than, or as a way of understanding the question of class. And I'm going to go back to what I said, in the brief thing, looking at Penn. I mean, if Penn were as white as it is rich, people would have a very, very different relation to what Penn or any Ivy League school, or for that matter, Duke, or to some extent my own school, UIC, was up to. So I think if we're thinking about this, we have to think about there actually is something at stake both analytically and, in fact, practically, in the relation between how we study race, how we think about the groups that Ashley talks about, the white group, and how we think about the fact that the white group is completely and totally divided by race, by class, as is every other racial group in this country. So when we actually, whether we're being essentialist about it or not, when we produce the relevant groups as racialized groups, we've already done a lot of political work. And we've done a lot of political work of what seems to me is exactly the wrong kind. It's political work that makes the, not just maintenance, but the exacerbation of class difference in this country easier, and makes the attempt to combat it harder.
I think that Walter and HADASS in their pragmatic position, do the what if, and I begin from the what is. And what is that the working classes, that the classes in the contemporary world system are racialized. So by just saying that, hey, we should not talk about race and join along the class axis, that's it, I don't think that that works. So for example, let's talk about one of the quotations that HADASS mentioned by Ignatieff. Ignatieff wrote this book on the Irish and suggested that treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. So think about the pragmatics of just saying no to whiteness. Will that eliminate racism from society? And by the way, turn that logic around. Shall I just say, I know that I would do much better in my life if I could quit my Black Puerto Rican position in this society. But if a police officer stops me and tells me, calls me nigger, and we're sorry to use the language, but that's what I have been called, I cannot just tell him, hey, I'm sorry, I'm a homo sapiens like you. You and I are fellow folks, yeah? That doesn't work, and it doesn't work for whites either. What I think needs to do is a critique of whiteness so that we can then engage in the policy of class solidarity. Regarding the argument about college admissions that Professor Ben Michaels argued, first, I think that those of us who work in these private universities recognize the desperate need to increase what you call economic diversity. Let's call it class diversity. That is central, and I have been in committees trying to do that and develop new policies. The concern I have is, and it's a concern that has been out there since the 1970s, is replacing race-based affirmative action with the so-called class-based affirmative action, hoping that the class-based program of affirmative action will produce race diversity. And the data is in. Like actually, I'm also in the business of data, being data-driven. Whenever we have tried that, and we tried in Texas, etc., it didn't work. And it didn't work precisely because the segment of the working class, the white segment, is slightly better off in terms of education, in terms of income, etc. So if you produce the so-called universal standard, guess who is more likely to get to the promised land? White folks.
And I say quickly, I'm not the slightest bit arguing for economic diversity in the university. If you did economic diversity in the university the way we do racial diversity, the universities that you guys teach in would disappear from the face of the earth. To do economic diversity would take almost all the students you have right now, who are in the top 20% of American wealth, and replace them with students from all over who A, could not do the work the way we do it now, and B, could not pay the tuition, and C, whatever other catastrophic consequences there are. My argument is not that we can sort of, make the universities pure meritocracies by actually getting rid of affirmative action. I'm no worried about that at all, or replacing with economic affirmative action. My argument is that the universities are doing the ideological work of this society, and that they're doing it no matter who they put in there, and that it's a mistake to think that the question of how many people of color or how many poor people get into the university has anything to do with the fundamental economic injustices of American society at all, except to try to make them irrelevant.
May I jump in here as well? So I just want to note this, I guess, explicitly before, what we're talking about right now is the fundamental, if you're not talking about race first, you're a class reductionist. You only care about economics, and you're ignoring the fact that there's massive amounts of racial discrimination that horrendously affects the lives of mainly non-white Americans, and mainly Latin and Black Americans, right? But as we've seen, Asian Americans as well more recently. So in terms of this claim of class reductionist, I think if I'm understanding you correctly, Eduardo, what you're saying is that what's going to happen is that you make these claims about I'm a person, you're a person, we're both working class, let's go get stuff, let's get stuff. And then what happens is you get a distribution where all this stuff ends up going to the white workers because you haven't addressed the racial element, perhaps. What I would say to this, issue of how is discrimination being addressed is that, okay, I'm a social democratic person, and I want universalized healthcare. That means I want hospitals all over that are free when you go in. But if I care about race, I don't want them just in white neighborhoods. That would not be that would be a racist universalist program if all the hospitals get built in white neighborhoods and not in Black neighborhoods. But in order to even have that conversation of where the hospitals need to be built, we first need the hospitals and the money for the hospitals and the policy for the hospitals. And we need to advocate within the fight for universal programs for racial equality. So the two go hand in hand. But the only way you address racial discrimination is if you have the resources in the first place to allocate things fairly. And so I think when you kind of frame things as class reductionist, it makes, or as, you know, putting the class thing first, it makes it seem as though there's not a concern about racial justice, whereas that is the way to get to racial justice, is through the economic lens of redistribution. So that
I disagree. I think that what I try to argue is deeper. I think that you have to deal with the race class question precisely because all the classes, and let's talk not just about the working class, but also the capitalist class, the petty bourgeoisie, and the segment that we call in the US, following Bavarian logic, the middle classes. We're all racialized, and we cannot just undo that. Now, the issue for us is what is the best practice to de-racialize the subjectivity of all classes. And I think that by just ignoring it and assuming that that will happen by fiat, by developing a sort of class-oriented politics without addressing the race question, we will never get to the promised land. Right now, we have, for example, a Reverend Barber trying to do exactly what I think needs to happen in the US, developing a race class politics, both at the same time. You cannot ignore the race component from politics, assuming that the universal class argument will allow us to get to the promised land. So my point is not against class reductionism, it's the need for a politics that deals with race class. By the way, today we're talking only about race as a version of identity politics. I leave for others to bring gender into the equation, because the same critique that we got 20, 30 years ago of being like, you know, you guys are dealing with identity politics was also launched against feminists, yeah? So that was my point. I'm not just saying that it's class reduction. It is that you need to have a race class politics.
I think I saw Ashley, you unmuted here, yeah.
Yeah, really quickly. One of the things that I wanted to raise as part of this conversation that I've always found curious about this idea that, but by focusing on race, we're ignoring the real problem, which is the economic inequality, and putting these things against each other rather than seeing them as integrated goes back to this very old argument, best expressed by Du Bois, that part of the reason why we don't have class consciousness and we're not fighting for economic inequality is in part because a lot of working class whites get a psychological wage. They see themselves as white, they benefit from being white, and therefore they don't work together with other racial groups who are lower on the socioeconomic spectrum to fight for class equality. And to sort of bring this back into sort of the evidence I have about the world, I also find it's strange that we sort of see the university as like the source of the problem that why economic inequality is being ignored, because the white people that I'm interested in studying, those who have a sense of solidarity with their racial group, who are also pretty against wealth redistribution in the United States, didn't go to college. The vast majority of them don't have a college degree. They weren't exposed to the ideologies of the university. If anything, this is a part of the larger framework of how race structures class in the United States, and the work that race does to help maintain class differences, because those class differences overwhelmingly benefit white elites.
You know, you could make it quicker, though, or maybe more analytically less charged, if you, instead of saying race and class and not worrying about which comes first, how they go together, we said there are two different problems here. One is the problem of discrimination, and it forms racism and sexism and various other ways of doing this. And one is the problem of exploitation. And we devote, as a society, an extraordinary amount of effort, correctly. Actually, no one on this panel, probably no one in this room, well, whatever this is, thinks that we should in any way withdraw or back off on our efforts to eliminate the force of racism, sexism, all forms of discrimination, to use a kind of broad term in that. But the point is that if you eliminated every single one of them, you would not change the fundamental economic structure of neoliberal capitalism. You would just change the people who were the beneficiaries, the skin colors and sexes of the people who are the beneficiaries and the people who are the victims. So fighting exploitation is something that is analytically different from fighting discrimination. And the point that's being made here is not that we shouldn't be against racism, we totally should be against racism, and not that we shouldn't talk about race. We totally should talk about race. The point that's being made is if you fight racism and you don't fight exploitation, all you create is a society that's exactly as unequal as the one we have now, except with different skin colors and different sexes at the different levels. And that in fact, the reason the academy is important in this way, but the reason our general media, the reason our entire media universe is important this way, is our media universe wants us to see everything as a function of discrimination, and in effect, virtually nothing as a function of exploitation.
So here's the problem. Yeah.
No, go for it. I was going to say I was going to allow one more comment from Eduardo, and then I do want to, I'll pose another question, but this is great, so I want to let this keep going.
This is going to be forever. We probably will never agree on this, but I don't think that we can make a distinction, as Professor Ben Michaels is making, between what he calls discrimination and exploitation, because both are integrated. The system of racialized capitalism, let me use the term that is in vogue these days, is already interrelated. So you cannot then separate what you call discrimination from exploitation. Secondly, I actually, in my own work, don't like the term discrimination, because discrimination forces us to go back to the issue of intentionality, of bad actors doing bad things. And actually, same as in capitalism, you don't need to have bad capitalists to have exploitation. You don't need to have bad white folks to have racial domination. Normative white behavior in terms of making selections about where do you live, who are your friends, etc., produce racialized outcomes. So in my own work, for example, I am very critical of social scientists who demonize the white working class because I claim that the white majority is racialized. So think about the Trump moment. People are like, oh, these poor whites, these white workers support the Trump. All whites support the Trump. The data is clear. And those who support Hillary Clinton are not beyond, Clinton in 16, they were not beyond race, yeah? They are differently racialized. So I don't want to make this distinction between discrimination and exploitation, because I want to fight both of them, because I think that both of them go hand in hand.
Great, thank you. So I want to ask a little bit of a question diving a little deeper into the briefs, and I think an important part of this discussion, which is, Eduardo and Ashley, in your briefs, you both focus on the material benefits that are conferred by this category of whiteness. I want to ask you to maybe expand on that and I think spell that out. And Eduardo, I'm adding a second piece to your question here, which is you also distinguish that your target is not only white supremacy and ideology of white supremacy, but you target the nice white liberals, was the quote from your brief. So I want to hear a little bit more about those two concepts. Ashley, maybe let's start with you on this question of these material benefits conferred by whiteness.
Yeah, and I think we can think about these material benefits as also symbolic. So it's not just the degree to which whites have captured the overwhelming majority of wealth in the United States, the fact that they hold the majority of elected offices in the US, sit on the majority of executive boards at organizations and companies in the United States. But they also get a lot of benefit from sort of being able to sort of see themselves as what is the norm in the United States, as what it means to be sort of a prototypical American. And part of what I think is happening in the United States today is a lot of anxiety over ethnic diversity and increasing diversity as a product of whites feeling anxious that that in itself is potentially going to change. That the America as they know it, a white America, is no longer going to become a white America. And this applies not just to the white working class, it affects a wide swath of white Americans. I think Eduardo was making this point before, but this is also something that applies to white liberals as well. One thing that we've seen in recent years is white Democrats have becoming increasingly more racially liberal on survey questions asking them about their racial attitudes. But at the same time, many white Americans are not very keen on diversifying their neighborhoods or sending their kids to more racially diverse schools because they know that diversity comes at a cost for them when they're talking about sort of things happening right in their backyard.
Thank you. Eduardo, if you'd like to respond to.
Okay, just on the first part. So I come probably like Professor Ben Michaels and HADASS from the Marxist tradition. So one of the problems that the Marxist tradition had was this economic determinism, yeah? So I believe that when we think about the material wages of whiteness, and I'm thinking about Du Bois not only talk about the psychological wages of whiteness, as real as they are, he also talk about better access to, obviously, better jobs, first hired, last fired, neighborhoods, yeah, access to parks, access to the goodies of life. So the materiality of whiteness is important, but it's not just limited to economics or just to the psychological wage. Regarding the second point about the good liberal whites, so again, I said it in terms of my own work, the demonization of poor whites, and we social scientists have been central to this agenda for 70 years. Actually, since the work of Theodore Adorno, yeah? We have been saying that workers have this authoritarian personality that leads them to be racist, etc., etc., etc. And again, I go back to my initial point. The racialization of the system began in the 16th century. Therefore, I think that you have to then address that today and think about, for example, how the white middle class, who enjoys sort of putting down their poorer brethren, at the end of the day, they are also racialized actors. And one reason why they may be more polite in their racism, yeah, they are more efficient in using what I have called in my work colorblind racism, is because unlike poor and working class folks, I'm talking whites, who are, because of their economic conditions, more likely to live closer to people of color and to work in similar jobs, the white middle classes can live in all these segregated communities, or when they are in professional jobs, the proportion of people of color they encounter every day is smaller. Yeah? Think about the academy. If you work in a department, like I have worked in many, where I am the only person of color, yeah? So my colleagues may be polite, but I'm still the only one, yeah? And I then experience this colorblind, polite racism, whereas the working class may be white working class may be more aggressive in their expression of their disdain for folks of color.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. Hadass, a quick response, and then I'll do one more question, and then I want to get to, we have some really great questions coming in from the audience.
Thanks. I had some questions, so maybe we'll get to them later, but I just wanted to throw them out there for fellow panelists of one thing just on the Du Bois note is that Du Bois's, this quote of the public and psychological wages of whiteness is often used as like the foundational moment of talking about white privilege. I just want to, he's talking in a very specific context. I think it's post or during Reconstruction, and talking about how it's operating in that context, not making a trans-historical claim. And I think it often gets taken out of that context. But the other thing is that he's talking about how that the public and psychological wages of whiteness affect their ability to have like race, to promote their long-term economic interests through solidarity action. So his conversation there is still about the necessity for needing to have racial organizing, cross-racial organizing to promote long-term interests. And then the questions that I'm curious about for fellow panelists is just, Professor JARDINA pointed out that about the material advantages of whiteness. But as I see it, having three people, three families own half the wealth in the country, right? It's not white people. It's a few really rich white people. And so how does this material advantage affect the 10%, 10.1% of Americans who are white living in poverty? I don't quite get how this translates to them. And then the other question I have is, Professor JARDINA, you mentioned white norms, and I've read a lot about these white norms, and I have yet to see examples of them. And if you have examples of what white norms are, where whites universally participate in these norms, I would welcome them, because I've had trouble finding that.
So I'll open, we can, those are great questions, Hadass, and thank you for posing those. I want to just put one last question on the table here, and then we're going to turn to our audience Q&A. I think all of your briefs actually also argued that in certain ways and at certain moments you see interests dividing the non-white and the white working class. I think Professor Bonilla-Silva is pointing out he's not limiting his discussion just to the working class, but a number of you made that point in your brief. I'm interested in hearing, and maybe then this will launch us into the Q&A, what those interests were and what you see the political results of those efforts. So I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand and respond. Walter, we haven't heard from you for a bit, if you'd like to kick things off.
Yeah, I don't think I should, because I don't think I understood the question.
Yeah, could you repeat it, Katie?
Sure. So a number of your briefs highlighted the fact that there were certain interests that at different moments in U.S. history have served to divide the white and non-white working class, or the white and non-white population. I'm interested in hearing what those interests were and what those results are. Just a little more detail there.
Yeah, so I mean, the basic half that argument is one that everybody knows. That is that the whole intensification of the idea of white identity that you particularly get after slavery and during Reconstruction, in a sense, was, as Judith Stein showed definitively long ago, a way, in effect, of dividing the working class. Eduardo made this point very well earlier on. So you divide the working class. If poor whites and blacks can't unite, in effect, what you've got is a working class that is divided against itself. The more interesting one, but no less powerful at the same moment, is the way in which it does indeed unite it unites white people. It's just like Ashley's groups, the white group. So yeah, the whole point of like the racists of the turn of the century back in the 1890s, right, is that the poor white person is supposed to feel a kind of identity with the rich white person. They're both, after all, white, and that whiteness therefore produces a sense that they have something as against black people. So that's a commonplace about racism. I mean, the more striking thing for us is that, in a certain sense, that hasn't worked out all that well. I said in my brief, it's not like, in my experience, like the white kids I'm teaching at UIC don't look down the street at the white kids at the University of Chicago and think, that's great, at least those white people at the University of Chicago are there representing me. And I don't know why we should think that, in fact, class antagonisms among black people should be any less than class antagonisms among white people. In a certain sense, the greatest enemy of poor white people is not black people, it's rich white people. And in an equal sense, the greatest enemy of poor black people is not rich black people. It is, the greatest enemy is rich black people. They're not their allies. We produce a racial discourse, and the racial discourse says, no, the first black person to do X, the first black person to do Y, all those black people at Harvard. This is Kim Crenshaw's point. They represent black people as a whole. But that's garbage. They don't represent black people as a whole. They are the class enemy of most black people. But what the function of racial identity serves there is to say, no, they're not your enemies. They're your representatives. You are one with them. So yeah, that's a kind of ongoing thing. And that's an argument about not why we shouldn't talk about race, but why when we talk about race, we should be talking above all about what's wrong with the idea of race and insisting on what's wrong with the idea of race. So that's what I meant, in my brief, which did indeed talk about those interests.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or responses there? Okay, well, with that, then we can get into some questions we have coming from the audience. So I'll start with one, which is, in recent years, we have seen more movement on and more successes for the American left. What role did or do race and racial politics play in this movement and in these successes?
Can I make a comment here?
Yes,
So
please.
it's interesting that if we look at the last arguably 30, 40 years of American history, and we're still in the US, I hope at some point we talk about Latin America and Asian countries, yeah, and Africa. A lot of the progressive movements have had a central sort of component of racial mobilization. The most recent one, obviously, was the Black Lives Matter movement. And I want to suggest that those movements are not just essentialist movement, Black identity movements, because the struggle for Black freedom from the beginning till today includes a class component precisely because the bulk of the Black and brown communities are working class. Today, for example, slowly but surely, the working class in general is becoming increasingly Black and brown. And we Blacks, we brown folks are significantly more likely to be in the working class than white folks. Actually, I was checking the numbers this morning. So for whites, it's about 45% or so, okay? And again, we can have a debate about how you define the working class. But for us, Blacks and Latinos is in the 60% range. So therefore, it's interesting to note that a lot of the left movements in the last 30, 40 years, the progressive movements, have come from folks of color.
So with respect to economics, what those left movements have done is stand by and watch the US become more unequal, more economically unequal every year since 1968 up through 2019. So we can talk about the successes of progressive politics, but when we're talking about the actual political economy of the country has become every year more unequal. So
don't blame that on the movement. Blame that on the white capitalist class that you correctly point out. That's the movements push, but the movements will not be able to get to the promised line until, on that you and I agree, until we develop that race-class solidarity. But the movements that have existed happen to have come from what Manning Marable called the domestic periphery at the core of capitalist accumulation, which is what Black and brown folks are in the US. That's Marable in how capitalism underdeveloped Black America.
Yeah, so there's an alternative account of the movement. What the movement's doing is fighting for basically racial representation. You know, let's get more people of color on boards. Let's get more people of color teaching in universities. Let's get more people of color attending.
I disagree. That's not what we're fighting for. We're fighting for everything. Right now, Reverend Barber is trying to help organize workers in Amazon, yeah? And these are Black, brown, and white workers. So but in that process, in that process, you got to deal with race. Because if the white worker says, I don't want to be with those people, that then is an impediment for organizing the working class. So don't tell me, and don't tell the world that, that the race class movement is not being done, because we're doing it. We're not just saying, we just want one person of color at Duke University, yeah? We want everything. We want equality. And we want, actually, in my case, I want a democratic socialist society like you. The difference is that I think that we cannot ignore the centrality of race in the race class formation. And you seem to believe that this is just a matter of an ideology used by the bourgeoisie to divide workers. I don't buy that.
I want to ask a question about organizing in that case with the Amazon example. So if you're an organizer, coming from a pragmatic perspective, then if you're an organizer and you have white members saying, I don't want to work with the Black and brown members, what are you going to use to appeal to the white members that they ought to organize with the Amazon Black and brown members who are interested in organizing?
What I would do, I engage all the time. I engage with the quote unquote racist or the racialized actor, whether it's a fellow colleague in my university or a white worker, etc. I engage. And then the arguments that you and I make, the class argument of trying to show that, hey, if we collectively fight for this, if we unionize, we don't have to be at the mercy of Jeff Bezos, yeah? So like you, I believe in engaging, but I don't believe that ignoring the race angle is the way of getting to nirvana. To get to the promised land of class race solidarity, we got to engage.
But I think what I'm trying to identify as the common ground, at least here, is that the idea is that you're trying, I mean, for me, the engagement that I think would be most effective is say, you have an interest that we have an interest in. Our interests are aligned here. and what helps you helps me, and vice versa. And that through that struggle, through struggling together on that, I think it's Cedric Johnson who writes about this, that collective struggle is the struggle that gets you into mutual understanding because your interests are mutual too. But I'm not persuaded that the effective way to deal with this is to tell the white workers at Amazon that they're more privileged than the Black workers, and that they might lose something if they actually become equal, because they won't lose something.
So I don't know if anybody knows that there are actually white workers at Amazon right now saying we won't join that union because there are Black people in it. That certainly happened in history, but I don't know that's happening at Amazon. And the crucial thing I'd say about Amazon right now is that, a bunch of us, probably all saw it too, have seen workers from Amazon in the last 2 or 3 days talking about this. Last night, we were watching 4 workers on TV, 2 of them on one side, 2 on the other. All 4 of them were Black. For all 4 of them, you want to say we're always against discrimination on both sides. 2 of them were against the union and 2 of them were for the union. The people who are our allies on the left are our allies in virtue of the fact they support the union. The people who don't support the union, I don't care if they're Black, green, or yellow, they are not my allies. We're all in favor of anti-discrimination. We're all in favor of ending racialized outcomes. Okay, but if what you're focused on is the question of what race they belong to and focused only on the racialized outcomes, you're missing the actual central ideological point here, which is, do we want to take power from Jeff Bezos? Do we want to take money from Jeff Bezos? We do. The Black, white workers who want to do that are on our side. The Black and white workers who don't want to do that are on the wrong side. Discrimination be damned one way or the other.
I want to just cut in because I saw, Ashley, you unmuted a little. There you are. Yeah, please go for it.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of touch on a number of different things. I wanted to first go back a little bit to the original question and just sort of talk a little bit about some of the big forces that are happening in the American political landscape that are, I think, speaking to this question. So one is basically over the course of the latter half of the 20th century, as the political parties started to take more clear positions on matters of race, you saw a lot of sorting on the part of white people moving into either the Democratic or the Republican camp based on their racial attitudes. And this sort of stopped right around the early 2000s. And what we've seen now in the world of rising partisan polarization, in the world in which our partisanship is also becoming a really important social identity, what's happening is that a lot of white Americans are changing their racial attitudes to align with their party. And I want to give a shout out here to work by Drew Englehart, who has done a lot of really great work looking at this realignment along racial lines. And so what that means is that the white Democrats, the white people who are in the Democratic camp, have become increasingly more racially liberal in recent years. In fact, white Democrats today are the most liberal on matters of race than they have ever been. Ever. And so this presents an interesting opportunity for actually a lot of work to be done to sort of push for both economically egalitarian and racially egalitarian policies. But there is one thing that's kind of pushing back against this, which is that you have the white Democrats on the left, or white Democrats who tend to be more educated, tend to be more socioeconomically well off, and the whites on the Republican camp are the ones who are less educated, the ones whose economic interest it would be to be fighting for this. But now they're not just polarized along lines of race, they're polarized along lines of partisanship, which has itself become one of the most significant cleavages in the United States, making it difficult, to HADASS's point, to even create common ground to sort of say to people, we should advocate for something that's universally beneficial, because partisanship and race are both deeply intertwined in the United States in ways that are just as complicated to untangle as economics and race in the United States.
Thank you. I'm gonna take this slight pause to put another question. We've had a number of questions come in asking about intersectionality, so I want to pose this question to the group. Walter, you brought up Kimberly Crenshaw, so we've heard a little bit here, but so this is a version of multiple questions that have come in. When talking about social and political justice, shouldn't we include other identities like gender along with race and class, and focus on the intersectionality of these identities to add more nuance to this conversation? Shouldn't any fight against racial exploitation actually emphasize these intersectional perspectives? And how can we use intersectionality to interrogate white supremacy as it relates to other forms of oppression? So that's like 4 questions in one. You don't have to tackle it all, but if anyone has some initial thoughts there.
you know, we should fight all forms of discrimination. Intersectionality seems to me like, you know, as said before, it's like the opiate of the professional managerial class. People love to, because intersectionality, in effect, fundamentally blurs certain kinds of lines. And the crucial lines it blurs is the line between what it means actually to be exploited as a member of the working class and what it means to be discriminated against in the broadest sense, racialized or sexualized outcomes. I'm not interested in people who are consciously discriminating, unconscious bias, et cetera, et cetera. So those are two different kinds of problems. They are, as Eduardo said before, you know, attached, just the same way everything's attached. You know, I'm both a man and I'm white. Those two things are different, but they're the same. They're both involved in me, but they're not as if they're analytically inseparable. They're totally analytically separable. And you just want to say that about every subject of capitalism. So yeah, I do think that there's a way in which, if what we mean by intersectionality is just that, we should be alert to fighting all forms of sexualized and racialized outcomes. I think I agree with that. I think it's uncontroversial, again, in this room. I think everybody agrees with that. But if you want to say that actually class, and remember that's part of the whole intersectionality thing, race, class, and gender, that class is part of that, you can't fight class differences in the same way. It's actually a complete mistake. The problem with class differences is not that people are, as it were, the victims of discrimination. They're the victims of a whole set of other procedures which would take place if you lived in an all-white society or an all-black society. So I think actually, if you just mean, yeah, let's pay attention to racialized and sexualized outcomes and try to avoid them, absolutely. If you mean that race, class, and gender have a more intimate relation and that three, in a certain sense, share different kinds of identitarian commitments, I think it's completely a mistake.
Can I say something? I just want to talk about the materiality of class formation, because if we only think that class formation happens in factories, yeah, we miss that class formation, as the great historian E.P. Thompson showed us, is a bigger process, yeah, and it has to, for us to develop the politics that the moment needs. We then have to understand that the class formation of the white working class includes separate neighborhoods, includes separate bars, separate this, separate that, which allows for that segregation, allows for the belief in their superiority, allows for this sort of feeling of entitlement. So it is plausible that one can produce a labor union in which you have blacks, whites, and brown folks without having class solidarity. That we have had in the US for a long, long time, yeah? So it's not enough for us to have the labor union. We have to have then a deeper race class politics if we're going to get to the promised land. So I think we need to think about class formation as this deeper process in which we don't limit it to the economic sphere and talk about other areas of class formation, culture, etc.
Thank you.
Rich people always like to have people talk about things other than money.
Great. Well, responses from Ashley or Hadass, or I can move on to the next question. Excellent. Okay. So two related questions here about whiteness. So how do you relate whiteness as an identity to white supremacy as a power structure? And a somewhat related question, I think, Ashley, a little bit targeted towards you. Is it that white people value the power of their identity, or do they really value something very concrete about being white? So again, whiteness as an identity versus white supremacy as a power structure.
So they're related in that whiteness is a social identity, just like we might think of Black identity as being a identity, and that they are both a psychological attachment that people have to their racial group. But the way in which whiteness works in American society, the consequences of this identity, the policies and political preferences that people have as a product of this identity are a function of the fact that racial groups in the United States are organized hierarchically, and white people, by having this identity and wanting to protect their group and benefit their group, are essentially trying to maintain a status quo in which other racial groups are not able to achieve equality. Now, what this means sort of practically, there's a lot of white people who have this sense of solidarity know this, they realize this. One of the things I've done in my work is I've asked people who've told me on surveys that they have a strong sense of white identity, what does that mean to you? Why do you feel that way? And what they say are things like, well, I'm really glad to be white because I know that I'm better off, or it would be hard to have been born a Black person in the United States. When I ask them questions about, like, do you feel like your group is privileged? This sort of loaded term that we often use in academia, that we hope privilege, we often think of recognizing your white privilege is part of the sort of move toward a racially egalitarian society. It's something that people who are very interested in racial justice recognize. Well, what I find in my research is a lot of people who have a high level of white identity do recognize that their group is privileged, and they're happy about it. They're glad that they're privileged. They wouldn't want to be somebody other than white. They realize that their group has these benefits, but they're not interested in relinquishing them. And I think that's something that's really important to sort of understand when we're talking about the way academics think about white privilege, and we're talking about the way that everyday Americans understand white privilege. And these are very different things.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Yeah, HADASS, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, that when white people are told they're privileged, they don't want to relinquish their privileges. So I don't think we should keep telling white people they're privileged if that's what, if you think that white people should relinquish their privileges. I'm skeptical that that's the right term to use in a lot of ways.
To be clear though, HADASS, I'm not telling them that they are privileged. Yeah, I'm asking them if they think that they have privilege. So yeah.
I wasn't imputing that to you. I remember in reading your book I think it's the last few pages, you specifically argue against using white privilege as a framing when communicating. Is that correct? Yeah, so I didn't mean to impute that to you. I was using your work as evidence for that claim. So thank you for that. But so in terms of this difference or the relationship between a white identity and white supremacy, so as I see it, white supremacists are very much behind the idea that white people should be in solidarity with one another. Which white people I don't think it's going to be all white people. I don't know if I'm making the cut there, but I think one of the claims that people talk about when they talk about white identity is that white people are in solidarity with each other. And this is taken as matter of fact. I don't think there's evidence for that historically or in the country that the white people are massively in solidarity with one another. And so that claim seems to be taken. So whereas white supremacists see themselves as, trying to promote this thing, the claim of people who study white identity, like Charles Mills's fundamental claim, who's a forefather of critical race theory and white privilege discourse, really says there is a cross-class white alliance. But then I don't know where that, where there's evidence for that with like the Southern strategy to some extent, but that is still, there's always been splits in terms of the parties in the United States, in terms of where white people fall. There's been always oppositional white groups to the racial status quo, et cetera. So it seems always like a bit of an overblown claim that when you have, a Republican Party that's majority white, that means that white people are somehow universally in solidarity with one another.
Thank you. Any more comments on this question about white identity versus white supremacy as a power structure?
I want to add a quick clarifying point to make sure this is clear to the audience. Sometimes when people say white supremacy, they're referring, or white supremacists, they're referring explicitly to these sort of bona fide right-wing groups in American society. They're talking about the KKK, they're talking about the alt-right. And other times when people say white supremacy, they're referring to this hierarchy, this power structure in which whites are at the top with this sort of dominant set of resources that they're trying to protect and preserve. So we mean this in two different ways, and I think it's helpful to be clear about which white supremacy we're referring to when we're talking about this.
Thank you. So I want to turn now to a question that we have from the audience, which is, what do you make of the fact that so many anti-racist actions and efforts to eliminate racism and discrimination are actually quite reactionary? What would a more proactive approach to ending racism look like? Eduardo, you specifically mentioned the concept of de-racialization, but what does it mean to de-racialize in practice? So Eduardo, since you were specifically named, we can turn to you for a first response.
Okay, so de-racialization is politics in the process. Yeah, I already said that if we're going to engage workers, and I'm going to focus now on workers, not the white middle class or the capitalist class that I don't give a damn about in terms of de-racializing. Yeah, let them be what they want to be. But in terms of the majority of folks, in terms of working class folks, we got to engage. And let me tell you, the left, not just the academic left, Walter, but the entire left basically abandoned the white working class for a long, long time. Actually, they left the South, etc. Which then, and that's what I kept talking about, class formation. Not only we abandoned politically, the Democratic Party, for example, ignored the white working class, thinking that, well, demography is destiny. We have a lot of people of color. They have nowhere to go. They will vote for us no matter what. So we don't need white workers. Well, look at what has happened in the last few electoral cycles. Yeah. So what we need to do is re-engage with the white working class, but that engagement, and that's my disagreement today, cannot be a naive engagement that assumes that the working class, the white working class, will be just a universal actor if we just don't talk about race. They cannot be what they are not. They are, HADASS, they do have a privilege, and it's not a big one. But in life, you don't need a lot of difference between, for example, the wages, the earnings of a black person and a white person for that to become a huge psychological boost. And if you add to that, neighborhoods, friends, etc., culture, then you have a gulf that needs to be bridged. So that's why I'm excited, for example, about what Reverend Barber is doing. And I was excited in the 1980s, I'm an old head, when Jesse Jackson attempted to do the Rainbow Coalition, which was a version, I think, of potentially a way of de-racialize the movement, of creating the race-class coalition that I think all of us agree would be a great thing to have.
So I do have a difference with you then on the point of privilege there, because I don't think freedom from discrimination should be framed as a privilege. White people are not discriminated against based on their race, and that makes their life easier in many situations. Absolutely true. But it's not a privilege to not be discriminated against. And when progressives frame not facing discrimination as a privilege, that is a regressive way to talk about rights and humane treatment.
So if the police kills a black man in the way they killed George Floyd and doesn't do the same to a white person, you don't want to see that as an advantage. I don't care if we use the word privilege. I personally in my work never use the notion of white privilege because actually I think it's limited. But call it what you want to call it. It is what it is. And those differences, which are, well, anyway, Walter, you wanted to say?
Go ahead, Walter.
Well, so if you think about, I mean, obviously, if you think about George Floyd, it seems to me a kind of pure instance of what a kind of political problem is here. So presumably all of us regard what happened to George Floyd as completely unacceptable. And there's no doubt that racism played a crucial role in it. It's also the case, as probably everyone knows, that actually more unarmed white people were killed by the police last year in 2020, the year of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, than unarmed black people. So we know why. We know why, because first of all, there are many more white people, so naturally. So the point is, black people are disproportionately killed by the police. But when we focus on George Floyd, and we focus on Breonna Taylor, we focus on all the names we know. And I, myself, to confess, I don't know a single one of the names of the white people who were killed by the police. We treat that as if the fundamental problem there is racism. The fundamental problem is that black people are killed disproportionately by the police. But in fact, the fundamental
and why is that? And why is that?
Because the fundamental problem, the fundamental problem is not that black people are killed disproportionately by the police. The fundamental problem is that people are killed by the police. And of course, we know who mainly is killed, both armed and unarmed by the police, is poor people. And we know why that is, not because the police are biased against poor people, but because the police's job is to control poor people on behalf primarily of rich people. So it's not that we shouldn't be completely outraged, and certainly are, by what happened to George Floyd, and that we shouldn't seek justice. But if we seek justice on the model of, no, this is wrong because it's racism, when in fact we completely ignore what the police do on a not daily basis. I think it's something like, I don't know, about 100 people, unarmed people, just focusing on the easy cases, unarmed people killed by the police. They're doing that as part of a systemic problem that would not be in any fundamental way altered if they more proportionally.
Walter, we're talking past one another. Walter, no one is safe. I think that none of us believes that class is not a central factor affecting policing or affecting anything in America. But you already pointed out, the big issue here is also disproportionality. If because I am Black and Latino, I am 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than a white person, that matters, yeah? So the issue for us is, again, going back to my first point, and we would probably never agree on this, the issue is how to develop the correct race-class policy to address both the class general issue, but also the race-class issue, because otherwise we may end up in a situation where, I'm thinking about socialist Cuba, yeah? And how happy many of us were with Cuba, except that in Cuba today, and I want to broaden the discussion to global sort of a capitalism, in Cuba, Black folks are worse off than white folks, yeah? So we got to deal with that. If the police is more likely to kill me than you, that matters.
Can I ask, I think I'm having trouble with this concept. So what would be the race class approach? Just so I can understand it. What would be the race class approach to making sure that less people are killed by the police?
First of all, recognizing that, in terms of policing, recognizing that from the get-go, policing in America was not just about poor folks, but also about Black folks, yeah? So if you read the history of the making the police apparatus in the US, and actually in the world, a lot of it was about policing Black and brown folks, yeah? So therefore, a correct politics would be to address that element so that we can then develop a new policing apparatus. Yeah, I assume that in the socialist society, we still will need some policing, yeah? But it would be a policing that will not be sort of racialized.
But I guess my question is, how do we address it?
So I'm just gonna cut in. We're getting close on time here. I think this is a good question. I do want to just try to get to a few more of our audience questions, maybe two more if we have time. We won't solve all this tonight, it sounds like. This next question, I think gets a little bit to what we were just talking about. So if the economic system in America is essentially racist, how do we understand Asians' economic success? Or is it important to disaggregate class and race, especially when we see racist attacks committed against Asians who are not necessarily compelled to occupy a discriminatory class position?
I was teaching about this morning, so I can tell you why that argument is wrong. The data on Asian Americans is problematic because we're comparing folks who are concentrated in urban areas and in 5 states in the nation. When you compare, for example, Asian Americans in California, in Washington, in Hawaii, in New York, and in Illinois, you find advantage white. So it's just a matter of statistics. If a group, let's say white or Blacks, are more dispersed in the nation, yeah, and many Blacks and whites live in Alabama, Mississippi, etc., poor states, yeah, and they don't live in urban areas at the same rate as Asian Americans, then that is why, if you look at the overall data, it looks like Asian Americans are out-whiting whites, which is not the case. In terms of the white violence against them, because they are also racialized subjects, yeah? And as such, they have been forever viewed as perpetual foreigners.
Yeah, let me just build on that, if that's okay, Katie, just to add to Eduardo's point. I mean, one thing is that we often treat Asian Americans as a monolith, but there's a vast difference in the different socioeconomic statuses of different Asian American groups across the country. We just clumping them together, we ignore that. And part of the problem is that when you clump them together, you see the fact that a lot of Asian Americans who have immigrated to the United States have immigrated with high levels of education and high skill sets and have been able to take jobs that afford them a higher socioeconomic status, but that's not the case universally. And to Eduardo's point, yes, Asian Americans have been racialized in the United States. They haven't just been racialized as forever foreigners, they've also been racialized in opposition to Blackness, right? They're racialized as the sort of model minority, a minority group that defies the stereotypes that we attribute to Black Americans, erroneously attribute to Black Americans as being lazy and hardworking and not subscribing to these values of individualism, where we see Asian Americans instead as playing by the rules and pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. And so that's important to the story, right? Because again, it shows how we allow race to structure the attitudes, not just of white people and Black people, but how we structure the attitudes of all racial and ethnic groups in the United States.
Yeah, so there is a kind of, I agree with that, but there's a real point to that, right? Which is that, yeah, the way they are the model minority, as I said in my brief, is that actually Asian Americans are currently within the group the most divided, stratified economically. There's the greatest gaps in income and wealth within individual racialized groups are within Asian Americans. They've led the way, but that's true of the country as a whole. It's just that Asian Americans are both extremes. And if you think about that, the poor Asian Americans, you know, you could say, well, but they're poor because they're discriminated against. That obviously doesn't work for richer Asian Americans. But the whole point of that, the group that's most like Asian Americans from that standpoint is white people. White people are also completely internally divided by class, right? Which is why when you see appeal to white people, what the white group feels, you're talking about some relatively small proportion of the white group feels. So, there seems to be the moral of thinking about what's wrong with the idea of the model minority is precisely the model of thinking what's wrong with the idea of whites and white privilege, which is the model minority doesn't have a certain kind of privilege, precisely doesn't. Some people within it have been very successful, some people not, within the Asian community. It's exactly the same for white people. Does that mean that Asians are, in some important sense, racialized? No, it doesn't. And this goes back to what HADASS said implicitly before. So, as we all very well know, we're Jews for many years in this country. Did that produce a fundamental problem for Jews as Jews? No, it did not. Jews are also internally divided by class. Jews have sort of made their way into the societies, in effect, class groups, more or less proportionally at every level. So I think, it's just a kind of, the minute we start thinking about the problem here as anti-Asian racism, we actually end up exactly in the kind of morass that we started with, which is the problem here is not sort of the internal differences within the Asian community with respect to, their different identities. The problem is fundamentally differences in class in the Asian community. And, we are on the side, right, presumably as progressives, of poor Asians, and we're not so much on the side of rich Asians. And when we get ourselves into thinking about, well, are we for or against anti-Asianness? Obviously, we're always against discrimination, but being against that kind of discrimination has no political meaning for the left whatsoever. We all don't want any Asian person to be beaten by anybody on the street. We don't want them to be beaten by the street if they're rich or if they're poor. But that's not what a progressive politics consists in. Progressive politics consists in trying to take away the money of rich Asians and rich white people and rich Black people and redistribute that money to everybody else.
So I want to pose just one quick final question, which I think is a nice way to invite each of you to quickly wrap up. Walter made a useful distinction between discrimination and exploitation. We've talked a lot about discrimination and some mixture of the two categories. If we had some idea of what an anti-discrimination agenda would look like, what would an anti-exploitation agenda look like? So sort of pushing us to look forward and out of this event, but also feel free to make any final comments here. We have just a few minutes. So whoever would like to go first. Ashley, go for it.
I'll use this as a way to sort of summarize too, because I think it lends itself to what I think is sort of a possible path for us to find a space of agreement. But also I'll express a little bit of my crankiness about this debate that happens not just here, but in academia more broadly. I find it really frustrating that we sort of have these conversations where we're like, white privilege, this is such a loaded term, it's a problem. Not all white people are privileged. Like, look at the poor white people. Not all Asian people are privileged. Or, you know, sort of like only a certain small number of white people have all of the wealth, or lots of black people or lots of white people are killed by the police too, right? Like I find that this is sort of the left kind of eating itself here, when I think that the real thing that we should be paying attention to is the fact that elites in the United States, wealthy white elites, use race as a way to prevent us from seeking economic equality. And that's part of the conversation that we're trying to have about the way that race is used. This is how race gets exploited by elites in the United States. It goes back to the argument that Du Bois made, and maybe he wasn't trying to make this about something beyond the period in time in which he was writing, but I think that it very much applies beyond this period of time, that white elites use race as a cleavage to prevent white working class whites from seeing themselves as having something in common with other racial groups in the United States, because it disproportionately benefits white people. And so what I think that we should be doing is holding politicians accountable for using race in this way, for using race to divide us, not liberal academics and universities trying to celebrate identity politics. It's barking up the wrong tree. The right tree is to go after the politicians and the people at the top who want to use race not in the sort of way of celebrating our difference, but use it as a social cleavage to pit Americans against each other and to keep Black people and other racial and ethnic minorities subordinated in the United States.
So I'll just fast summarize this. I can't answer all the way forward with the agreement, because I want to say I just disagree completely with what Ashley just said. And the form I disagree with is this. I want to say, yeah, no, today, white elites don't use racism to divide the working class. They use anti-racism to produce exactly the same kind of effect. That the point of anti-racism is precisely to present us with a kind of meritocratic model of equal opportunity in which we could just get rid of racism, get rid of sexism, get rid of all those things. Then, although we would be economically unequal, at least everybody would have fairly achieved the particular level of immiseration that they've managed to achieve in an economy in which more and more people are in fact immiserated. And that it is the utopian version of anti-discrimination in itself that is the most powerful ideological tool of the, no doubt, primarily white elites in the US today. And if what you want to do is to go forward in a way that actually is going to make some sense, it's not that we should give up anti-discrimination or anti-racism or anti-sexism. We should be completely committed to it. But if we're committed to it as a primary or even above all in itself, and we're not committed to anti-exploitation, not only do we have no future for the left, but we are in fact doing the rights business for it.
I strongly disagree with Professor Ben Michaels.
But there is a God.
With the idea that elites are using anti-discrimination to divide, to do the politics of the moment. Because it's interesting that Trump wanted to forbid critical race theory and was attacking folks like me and Ashley, whereas I didn't see him targeting Marxist scholars in the academy, as they did, as you know well, in the 60s, 70s, and perhaps the 80s.
Well, it's because there are only 4 of them now, Eduardo.
I didn't interrupt you. Let me make my point, and then we may not agree, and we will never agree, probably. But I do believe, like you, I am also against anti-exploitation. The problem is that you think that exploitation doesn't have a racialized component, and I think that it has. In that sense, I am with HADASS. I know that you don't like my brother, the racial contract, Charles Mills. I think he talks, Charles Mills addresses this, and Charles Mills, like HADASS, Walter, and I, also come from the Marxist tradition. Something happens when you are a Black Marxist, when you're a Black person, that you still have the class concern, but you would be blind if you don't deal with race, because race is in your face 24/7.
I would like, so I'll jump in and just answer the question. We all haven't moved much, probably. I'm with Walter on this one. And thank you for one of the least stilted conversations on Zoom that I've been a part of. So it was not too many moments of silence. And so just to answer your question, which is what is a anti-exploitation program look like? Public goods, universal healthcare, universal childcare, universal elder care, and down the list. And hopefully we'll get there, and it will lift all boats.
Amen.
So I will say thank you here. Thank you for those final comments, and thank you really for this entire panel. HADASS said we didn't necessarily move positions on the panel, but I think what you've offered to our very extended audience here tonight is a really useful look both into how these questions are being approached in the academy, but I think more importantly, how they're being approached in real politics. So I know that both your briefs and this event are going to continue sparking conversation. So please, you can't see because it's muted, but I'm sure everyone's applauding in their homes or their cars or wherever they happen to be. But thank you all for joining. On behalf of the Andrea Mitchell Center, I'll say thank you and hope to see you all in real life. I think we can start saying that now very soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Ashley and Eduardo. I mean, we're not live anymore, are we?
Oh, we are now off?
We're
not
yet.
I'm happy to say it if we're still on. I just want to say thank you for the conversation. It was totally fun.
Thank you. Again, this agreement, disagreement, engagement is for me the important thing. So
Yeah.
Absolutely. Likewise.
Charles Mills was my colleague for many years.
Oh, I know.
I disagree
By
with
the
him
way,
all the time.
and you have two of my former students know you well, Tyrone Foreman and Amanda Lewis in sociology.
I definitely know Tyrone and Amanda. Anyway, thank you, guys.
This was a pleasure. It really was nice to get to talk about all of this with you and meaningful to me. So I really appreciate it. Yeah. Have a good one.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.